Once you make sure you've got enough clay wedged and prepared for your entire piece, we're going to start rolling out our slabs. We're going to do that by taking our piece of clay and dividing it into 2 or 3 pieces so that we're not rolling out too much at once. And we will roll out a little bit and then flip it over, and roll out a little bit more and flip it over until it becomes as thick as our little stoppers, which we're using those 2 yardsticks taped together to stop the rolling pin from rolling out our slabs too thin. It's important to prepare and roll out all the slabs at the same time when we're making a slab construction piece, so that they all are the same consistency and moisture level. Next, we'll take our paper templates that we prepared ahead of time and we'll lay them on to the slabs and try to maximize the space on each slab by laying them close together, making sure that the entire piece is completely on the slab and an edge is not hanging off. And if you get to the point like I just did where my 5th square did not fit, and your slab is a little bit on the thicker side, you can try rolling it just a little bit thinner to make space for that 5th piece, or you'll have to roll another piece. So it's important to make sure that you're preparing enough clay ahead of time where you have a little extra just in case. Another option is to trim 4 of your 5 pieces and then use the excess that you trim off to wedge back together and then roll back out. And sometimes that's enough for your final piece so that you've got the same clay that you are using for all of your slabs, which is really ideal. And you can see I am using a cutting tool to cut along the paper. So it's really important that you go slow and carefully, and keep your tool straight up and down so that you don't get a weird angle, because that can give you a really strange slab. So take your time with this. And you can see I just dragged my tools sideways, and that's actually a little harder. So you can notice in this next one that I cut, I actually turn the slab as I'm cutting so that I'm always pulling my cutting tool towards me, because that's a lot easier to cut a straight line. So we're going to trim off the excess from each piece and lay them out on our board, and then set a timer for about halfway from the end of class so that you can flip them halfway through and they dry evenly, because we want them to get to that leather hard state. I decided to prepare a 6th slab just in case I make a mistake with one of my 5, or if I decide to make a lid for my container. So right now I'm using the excess clay that I trimmed off of my first 5 slabs to roll out one last slab and make one final square slab the same size. I'm just using one of the paper squares that I already cut for my sides, since they're all the same, to lay on top of this new slab that I rolled out. After we get all of our slabs created, we'll want to do a little cleanup just to make sure the edges are smoothed and even. And we can take a very lightly dampened sponge to clean up the edges. We can take each slab and just tap it onto the flat board to make sure each side is straight and flat, and just try to make them as square as possible, so as they become leather hard, they are already the correct shape and they fit together really well. So you can see right now I'm just using that dampened sponge to clean up any irregular edges. The clay is really wet and workable right now, so if one of the corners got smushed or pushed out of place, I can tap it back in so that it's straight. While the clay is still wet and workable, now would be the time to press in any details. So if you want to use your texture stamp from the beginning of the semester to press some designs into the clay, this would be the time to do it. Just be sure not to push too hard so that you don't distort the shape of the sides of your box. Something else to think about is when we are assembling our slab container, these tiles might need to be trimmed a little bit smaller, a little different shape for them to fit together properly. So we'll have to kind of take that into account with where we're putting the designs. So that's why I am putting my designs in from the edges a little bit, so it gives me some room to play around with trimming off a little bit of clay where I need to so that my box fits together properly. If you do choose to use your texture stamp to press your designs in, make sure you just do a gentle kind of wiggle, rocking it back and forth and side to side, just really gently to avoid pushing too hard and making the square no longer a square. So just be really gentle with it and kind of rock that texture tool side to side and forward and backward. Once we have our tiles prepared, and I've flipped mine over so the designs are facing down, we'll want to lay them out on a piece of plastic wrap so that the board doesn't pull the moisture out of the clay. And it will also warp and kind of round up. So we want that board to stay flat. So we'll want to place a piece of plastic wrap over top. And at the end of class, after we flip them halfway through, we'll want to wrap them up really well and make sure that the air is not able to get to the clay at all. Because if the air can get to the clay, the ones on the end where the air is touching will get really dry and the ones in the middle will stay wet. And we want them to be all the same consistency. Once our slabs are leather hard, so that means I could hold the slab at the edge and it would not flop downward. It would keep its shape, so it would stay flat if I held it at the very side. Another way you can check for if it's leather hard is by just gently trying to bend it, and if it bends a little bit, that's a good thing. If it feels like it's gonna break, that means it's too dry, and if it bends very easily, it means it's too wet. So that's how we check for leather hard. Then we'll take our very best square tile or our very best shape and use that to trim the others and make them as square as possible. And then we can lay out our tiles in the order that we want them to go. So I picked my ugliest one to be the bottom tile, and then I am laying each side along the edge of the bottom that it's going to be attached to. And then here's where we'll have to do a little thinking. So if we want the tiles to go up on top of that bottom slab, 2 of the tiles will have to be trimmed skinnier so that they can fit on that bottom square tile. Otherwise, the 4 squares put together will be too large and they won't fit together on that bottom tile. So we'll have to do a little bit of thinking here and figuring out how it's going to all fit together. So the best way to do that is do a dry fit. So right now I'm kind of thinking and measuring and trimming the tiles that need to be trimmed and making those a little bit skinnier so that when I do start to score and slip and put them all together, they'll fit onto that bottom piece. Now that I have my pieces dry fit and I'm sure they're all going to fit together, now I'm starting to score and rough up the bottom tile where I know that all the tiles are going to connect to it. And then I'm going to rough up the bottom of each of the tiles that will be the sides of my container. And then I'll have to rough up the edges of the tiles where they're going to touch each other and come together. So I've got a lot of scoring to do and thinking to do to prepare all of these pieces and get them ready to attach together.